Here is a simple example of using the Keynesian Cross to address this problem. So the government of a small developing country gives all public sector workers a large pay rise. Use the Keynesian Cross Model to explain the expected effect on output. And then the second part is what's the limitations of this analysis. So let's look at the first part, the simple prediction from the model, where in the model we have output along here and expenditure along here. And here's the line where output is equal to expenditure. Of course, the principle of this model is that expenditure can only be equal to output. So everything you spend comes from something you earn. The other principle of the model is that the planned expenditure comes from consumption, investment and government spending. And you can add on net exports, but we're going to ignore the trade sector here and just concentrate on these internal sources of demand, so consumption, investments and government spending. So we start in this question here at the income level of, let's call it Y1. And the first thing we're told is that all public sectors have a large pay rise. Now that would be an example of fiscal policy. So all public sectors having a pay rise would be an increase in government spending. So we start with an increase, so I write it's plus delta in government spending. So government spending goes from G up to G1. Let's start from G0 and go to G1. And that means that if government spending increases, then expenditure will increase. So this is where we start at. That means we're going to have an increase in expenditure. And that'll go from E0 up to E1. So suppose we start at level E0 here, and then if we increase G from G0 to G1, these things stay the same. Then the higher level of expenditure, E1, will be given by the same level of consumption, same level of investment, and same level, an increased level of government expenditure, G1. And that means that's difficult to get parallel lines on this thing. We'll try. We shift up to this level, the expenditure, and we move up to this level of income because expenditure has gone up and expenditure and income must be the same. So the new equilibrium would be here, given the level of outputs going up to Y2. Let's change that from Y0 to Y1 to be consistent with everything else. It means that output would go up to plus delta there, plus an increase in government spending, an increase in E expenditure, an increase in Y, going from Y0 up to Y1. So the conclusion is that this would lead to an increase in outputs, and the increase in outputs will be bigger than this, because this shift upwards here, the only thing that's moved the expenditure up this way, vertically, is the change from G0 to G1, so that's equal to just that change. But this change here, increase in Y, would actually be bigger than the increase in G. So the increase in government spending, this distance we've shifted up spending, leads to a bigger increase in outputs. And that's because we've changed C indirectly, because some of the government spending goes to people, and then people spend some of that money on their own consumption, and some of that money goes to other people and they spend that on their consumption and so on. So the direct effect of G is to move that line up, but then there's an indirect effect through increasing consumption, which means this is bigger. And that's the multiplier effect. So what we predict is an increase in y that's bigger than the increase in g. And the exact amount as big would depend on the value of the multiplier. We don't have the information to work that out. Now briefly looking at number 2, what are the limitations of this? That's our conclusion of 1. The limitations are, well, we've assumed that interest rates assumed constants. Whereas in fact, there could be, if this change in government spending and consumption, if that had any effects on interest rates, then interest rates could have an effect on investments and also consumption. So that would complicate the results. If we wanted to look into that, you'd need to go further and look at the ISLN model. The other assumption we've made is that there's no change in the price level. And for that you need to look at the ADAS model. So it could be that increased government spending just push up prices, and of course at higher prices people can afford less and so on. That all the effects that the ADAS model captures. But this simplistic model here is assuming that interest rates and prices stay the same, and in that case we expect to get an increase in output bigger than the increase in government spending, according to the multiplier. And of course you can go further and say, well, in actual fact there are some more specific assumptions about what happens to public sector workers. It means we assume that public sector workers spend some of the large pay rise, they don't just save it all. We assume that there's not some kind of revolution, that this could lead to a knock-on effect where private sector workers demand a large pay rise and so on. So those effects as well are beyond the scope of this model. We could bring those into discussion. Having looked at the basics, we could say, well, what else is likely to happen in this situation? Is it possible that in this small developing country, public sector workers are such a small section of society that it really has virtually no effect at all? Or could it be, as I say, that their behaviour changes, so they no longer consume, or in reality we have to assume that there would be some exports and inputs here, so it might just go on imported luxuries, or they might send the money overseas. So having made the basic analysis, we can then look at some assumptions that could be varied and look beyond these models to broader sort of political and practical questions. But we always start with the basic point of departure, which is we expect some increase in y from this increase in g. And that's the end of that example.